Welcome to the final session of today. Thank you for your patience and your perseverance with many deep and broad issues that have been explored during yesterday and today at the symposium Architecture Making Effect. And we've been just exploring many themes today, which I think this last session culminates in a really effective way. So for us, inside of the symposium experience, we've been talking today about criticality, different modes of criticality, emerging perhaps projective or constructive approaches to criticality in which making practices and different kind of techniques and performances and formations of architecture can become part of a critical practice. We've also been discussing then both the making and the practice part of architecture and modes of criticality, ways of being critical within the increasingly complex, and as we heard with the wonderful last wrap-up by Joan Ochman, neoliberal smooth condition in which we work and exist today. So in this last session, we're going to discuss in many ways the ethical dimensions of two examples of perhaps you could say critical or feminist or decolonial practices in a way. We have two sets of speakers. We're going to switch the order that you find in your program. We'll start with a presentation by Constantin Petcou and Doina Petrescu from Atelier d'Architecture autogérée. Many of us know them. Doina has been on the advisory board and with us through many events, and it's wonderful to reconnect now. And we'll listen to them about their practice for about 35 minutes, with which hopefully leaves us time for questions. And following that, we'll hear from Sandi, Hilal, and Alessandro Petti, who are going to speak about their practice DAAR and the decolonizing architecture initiatives that they've been involved in. And the theme that connects them both and that hopefully they can draw out in their presentations, and maybe we can even look further at in the questions, is what is the ethical position, or what are the ethical commitments of the architect or the researcher in these kind of critical projects or critical practices? How do we position ourselves critically, and how do we position criticality in interventionist situations? So how do we engage in ways in very complicated situations, and then how do we think about the positionality and ethics of that engagement? And also, perhaps especially relevant for our first presenters, how do we then, when we leave those situations as architects, when we leave our interventions to live on in the world, what does that do? How do we relate to the effects that architecture can have after we leave? With that framing of making effect and ethics, I'm really pleased to introduce then in a little bit more detail Atelier d'Architecture autogérée, which means studio for self-managed architecture, which is a practice based in Paris and co-founded by Constantin and Doina in 2001. AAA, the acronym for the practice, acts as a platform for collaborative research and action on the city, and much of their work is carried out with other specialists across disciplines and including locals with different kinds of non-academic or other kinds of ways of knowing as well. So they work with universities, arts educations, NGOs, and locals in very intricate and complex way over long periods of time. And whilst the founding members of AAA remain and may continue on to different projects, the the projects left behind act to network in various ways in a self-managed way by the local people, which has another kind of dynamic than perhaps a traditional architectural practice. So with that, I'm very happy to hand over to you for the first setting out of an example of ethics and architecture.
Thanks a lot for this great introduction, and also for reminding that we are long-term friends of this group, and that we feel incredibly honored to be asked again and again to come and to show maybe the same thing with a little bit of progress. And I think somehow maybe it's interesting for you to follow the process which parallels somehow your own processes. So today we wanted to speak about commoning architecture and about the question of commons, which is at the heart, I think, of the discussion on democracy. And you know, many of us know that you know, there are lots of political philosophers speaking about this, because I think they consider, like for example, Antonio Negri considers the question of commons as the contemporary revolutionary project that might counter somehow this neoliberal tendency, and this project is concerned with capturing, with diverting, with appropriating and reclaiming commons that exist as a constituent process, you know, everything that we are doing in common, but also this reappropriation, it is at the same time a reinvention. We have to reinvent categories, institutions, form of management, ways of teaching architecture, forms of governance, new spaces, and sometimes new actors also. An entire infrastructure that can be both material and virtual. And architects and designers, I think, have an important role to play in contributing to setting up this infrastructure for commons. And somehow this was our programmatic position since we started in 2001. Even before this discussion on commons started, and we wanted to enable, as architects, the access of city dwellers to space in the city, and we wanted to use our means for this. So this was somehow what we defined as our architectural agency. And understanding also architecture as a process, and architecture as socially produced, you know, in a Lefebvrean line. And for this reason, we organize ourselves in the way that you described, as a platform rather than as a liberal practice, something that is open to other non-architects, for example, users of our projects. So we were concerned also with issues that are, you know, have to do with space, but also with access to space, with power over space, with increasing this capacity to producing, but also more recently with the idea of resilience and civic resilience, and with the ecological threats that we are facing, not only as architects, but certainly as citizens of this planet. And how to enable ordinary citizen to act towards improving our ecological condition.
Thanks. So, in 2008, after our formal initial project, small-scale project, tactical projects called EcoBox, and much more Knun and 56, we decided to question a more problematic and fundamental issue with our planet, this one. And so in a way it's a larger scale maybe for us, probably for other ones too, and usually it's not a scale to act and to develop projects. There are some analyses, so by example by IPCC in 2007 or by WW Foundation, and they conclude the impossibility to act in local scale against global crisis. And our planet actually is in a lot of series of dangers, climate warming, global warming, food crisis, energy, etc. And usually, so the scientific, they conclude it's impossible to act locally against this global crisis, so you must expect some protocols like Kyoto, like Copenhagen, and they are not so proud, you are not so proud about, like COP21, and in the US, Donald Trump is elected and everything is stopped, or more or less. And via our former project, you discover something very interesting, is to act locally, and by this self-managed process in which the initial users, they start to be stakeholders, so they continue the project, but what is very important, sometimes they develop the project and many ones. So it's like what you call a rhizomatic dynamic. You decided to act locally and maybe to be much more like tactical, to be strategical, and maybe to try to develop a movement. This is a really big utopia in order to act locally, but by dissemination to propose a solution in a larger scale. So you know a lot about Anthropocene. So now it's actually really scientifically proved to about more of the crisis to be caused, to be originated by our activity, human activity. You know about the origin of this crisis, so everything it's concerned, the transport, but the energy production, construction, agriculture too. So in fact, everything is concerned in the global crisis. So in fact, you must to change everything. And in a very simple words, you must to change our lifestyle, our Western consumerist lifestyle. And it's very difficult because we live in very nice country, rich countries. And of course, if your country is richer, you consume more and you produce much more pollution. So the real card of the map of the world is like that. So the north rich countries, they pollute much more like the other ones. So you have a big responsibility in Europe, maybe to invent new way of life, new way of everyday life. And this is very different because even if you are concerned, it's very very difficult to change something. Because if you go to the supermarket and if you buy some food, some legumes, they come from everywhere in the world. This is a case in Rotterdam, by example, probably it's the same here. And so it's very difficult how to act locally against global crisis because you don't have choice. And there are some political programs, like in France, Grenelle de l'Environnement, just after the 2007 IPCC analysis, so the IPCC, they proposed to reduce by 4 the carbon emission, and the French government, they proposed to do that from 2007 to 2050, and actually what you observe is just this reduction. So it's nothing comparing what you must to do. So if the time passes, the reduction must to be stronger or to stop everything. So how to act in this situation, like architects, maybe you are concerned, I don't know, in our case you're supposed to be. And so it was really in 2008 when we started this project, it was like a utopia, but our idea it was to start locally and to develop with residents, with stakeholders, with municipality, with other partners, many projects, and you started in Colombia in 2009.
Yeah, in fact, this is for some of you. You might remember you were also at the beginning of the Making Effects project. We have shown this project, which was at the very beginning, and and we thought that it's interesting somehow to show it, what has become after 5 years, which was also the duration of a few projects, as a process. The idea, I mean, was again, we dare to remind you, is that it was a framework, a strategy that we proposed as a model of a strategy to create a network of citizen-run projects around a series of self-managed collective hubs hosting economic and cultural activities and everyday practices that will contribute to boost, I would say, local resilience at different scales. And the network will start, for example, at the neighborhood scale, which is the scale which is directly accessible to citizens. But then it will grow progressively at a city and then maybe even regional level. And I think this is an alternative to the current approaches to urban regeneration, because it really shows, what is this infrastructure which is necessary for to give agency to citizens. And somehow the first step was this creation of civic hubs that are somehow replacing the type of, welfare infrastructure provided by the welfare state. This is not state-run, this is civically run. These hubs will be located on using land opportunities, sometimes on temporary available spaces, the derelict buildings, with this idea of reversible use also. And they were meant to be transformed into collective hubs where change can be initiated, tested, learned, practiced. And the idea was also that the hubs will provide space and resources and training for emerging and existing social and ecological stakeholders. And these hubs that will be part, let's say, of the same logic will function through locally closed circuits, balancing consumption and production, reducing CO2 emission, encouraging people to live and work more ecologically, and at the neighborhood level, the kind of performance, the ecological performance could be visible, could be monitored by the people themselves. And the networks of hub could also federate other existing initiatives. Local businesses can little by little turn more green and join the network, through sort of local circuits. And with this modeling, we started to contact municipalities in the suburban area that around Paris, and we set up, at the end, we found a municipality that was interested in a partnership. At that time, it was a majority of socialist and ecologist party in the municipal council, and with them we have obtained European funding for environmental governance innovation to apply this strategy. What was, I think, important, at least for us in terms of power relations, was that we, as a sort of small professional organization, were the coordinator of this project, and the municipality and other organizations were partners. So it was a much more evenly distributed, I would say, partnership in which municipality, for example, was meant to play a different role than the one of being a client. And we started with 3 hubs. I mean, this is how the project was described, with 3 hubs, one for urban agriculture, another for recycling and eco-construction, and another was cooperative housing, in such a way that we have complementary activities and we are covering, I would say, the main or a part of the main urban functions. Two of them we managed to build. The third one we didn't. So the first one was the one for urban agriculture. And somehow we strategically started with it because it was the one which was the easiest to understand, to access, and it was in the core of a socialist state neighborhood. It was meant to be at the same time a cultivation place, a pedagogy place, and a place for ecoculture, comprising of a micro farm, collective gardens, education and cultural facilities, a cafe, also, food production spaces, not only food growing, and the local mini market, so where food can be distributed in the area in such a way that local circuits can be, I would say, easily and naturally set up. Also, we imagine that the building itself and the project itself will showcase what it prones, as for example, to be independent in terms of energy, in terms of water use, and so on. And we started in 2012 with the garden and with the community garden part of it, because we wanted the people to have immediately access to space and transform it. And we didn't do anything before the first harvest. And then we started the construction with this idea of having a reversible construction. And this is how it looked like, with recycled materials completely, but also with thinking about space in a different way, in such a way that we are minimizing energy, for example, using passive energy systems, and having multiple use of spaces. And this was the mini market and different activities, but also parallelly we have prototype. I think this would be, I would say, a sort of pragmatic research, hands-on research, inventing and trying new facilities, new ecological facilities that would help this ecological cycle and these ecological parameters to be attended, like the water filtration. And by doing this, we have also tested the, I would say, policy limitations, because we had to obtain sometimes different derogations from in terms of policy, because there was no policy for such facilities. So we had also for the compost heating, and I think it was interesting to see what would be the effects of such an idea about architecture on the architecture itself. And for people, was very, very important to see, to test, to have tangible demonstrations that all this recycling is working or is not working. For example, watering systems. What is how to water and what are the effects of this watering system. Here we have worked with an ecologist, for example, also on planting techniques that are adapted for polluted soils, as we have in the suburbs. And this is how it looked like in 2014.
So the Recyclable was the second hub developed starting with 2012. And what is really important, when you start, in fact, all these people living in banlieue, they don't feel concerned by these topics, and this is normal. So they have a lot of problems, health problems, job problems, house problems, and in fact, by this everyday life opportunity, they discover how to pass from everyday life issue and problems to larger scale and to feel to be concerned by that. And this was a very important result for us. The second hub, Recycle Hub, was developed in a cul-de-sac in a street who was cut by highway with the necessity to build between the trees. So you build with containers because all the street it was with electricity, water, and gas and other things on the underground. So without the possibility to have foundation. So the first level was like a foundation for the second one. So everything is very ecologic by reusing containers, wood, etc. And the first level was for makers with workshop, professional and participative too. The second one, it was for designers, like a co-working space, and some other space for stored local waste and reusing local waste. But it's really important, it was the necessity to start to pass to this self-management of this complexity of projects. So we develop small groups of decision, of responsibility, so of governance in a way. You invite a lot of researchers like Ramia and other ones to come to exchange with them, to propose transfer of skills and topics, students too. And step by step there was a lot of people involved in bottom-up dynamics, ecological one and social one. This is a group involved in a repair cafe movement, so it was a series of voluntary repair of user everyday life goods. And all the users, they come from different cultural backgrounds, and this is important too, because on the beginning not was the case, because it's like that. It was a series of residency with designers from Italy, from Holland and other ones, and they work with the residents too in a better and better level. So it was like an empowerment process for them. So it was a series of screenings, so for schools too, for kids, for everyone. And step by step appear some groups interested to develop their own activity, their own entrepreneur economic activity, and it was for local economy and green economy. So this is really important. The hub, there was like opportunity for people to enter in a transition, ecological transition. If not, they are concerned, but they don't have the possibility. And step by step, the units, they start to be self-managed and self-financed too by the economical activity. So the small groups, they pay the charge of the place, and you was able to retire from the project. So starting with 2014, both units, they was self-managed, and Recycle was a place to develop different kind of activity, like repair cafe, like recycling unit workshop, like eco-design residency and coaching and other ones. So they start to pay the place to the charge, electricity, etc. In the AgroCité, it was the same case. So there was groups for education, for training compost makers, and they was really successful because they was first one in France probably, and they formed more like 150 compost makers for different municipality. So like him, and probably this was a default finally, because in 2014 there was elections. And Doina, you are able to explain better what's happened.
Yeah, but before this, I think this is, for example, only for AgroCité, a map of the different initiatives that are all forms of economy. Also, we were working a lot with this idea of diverse economy that were sometimes informal and sometimes formalized, that there were mixture between sometimes also entering the market, and I think this is a very important way of showing the project, and also through its let's say ecological parameters that and other types of outcomes, like the new jobs that were created, the activating people, and from passive, let's say, users to become active stakeholders, having hold in the project was very, very important. And also, having a very rich network of partners of all kinds, from international institutions to local organizations and specialized or informal organizations, and somehow this transversality also was very important for a network to establish this proactive ecological citizenship that Urban promoted. But there were also challenges, and I think it was not easy to work. We had this, let's say, political ecological approach to go in places where we do not speak about ecology, and to challenge the people that don't see any urgency in acting ecologically. So it was a long way to work with them, also to create responsibilities with these new practices, to sustain also an agonistic approach, because there were conflicts continually of understanding of how to position yourself in a project that didn't exist, in an experiment, let's say, and also with institutional and political support, because these new roles that we assigned to different institutions were not always easy to understand by all the services, and the access to space and land, because we had a limited access, and this became really critical at the end of the project, and the relation with power, which somehow manifested itself very strongly. I really don't know what we can do to improve this. Yeah.
Just a second.
No, it continues, I think, to flip. Anyway, okay, good. So this was settled, hopefully, but our situation was not settled at all, because the municipality changed at the last local election. So we had a right-wing municipality that completely denied all the engagement of the previous municipality, and claimed back the land on which this project was installed. And I think it's somehow interesting as a situation, because we can see that even the question of ethics, can be contested, and also the notion of impact. I think nothing about what we quantify as impact of this project was recognized by this municipality, so they were in complete denial. And because we didn't want to leave, there was a case to court, and they pretended that they need this urgently because they want to realize temporary parking for the neighborhood, which was in transformation, and it was interesting to discover that there is no legislation to protect commons. So the commons are currently negotiated with political will. So there where exists, but there is no, the right to use is not protected, for example, and the right of collective use is not protected. So we have lost the process, but we went further and with an appeal, and I think this created a sort of delay in the process, which was extremely constructive, because lots of people heard now about the project, like even The Guardian, but there were articles in different other important journals, we started a campaign of resistance, and I think we realized that to produce commons in this time means also that you have to fight for them. It's not enough to just make them, and we had a lot of support internationally. Amongst them, lots of international institutions, including KTH here, and then we thanks a lot to all those that supported us. So we had 70,000 signatures support on our petition, which were more than the elector of the votes that this mayor had. And at the end, it was we were almost winning the appeal. I think there was a debate at the Cour de Cassation, and we managed to, to lose at the end. But two other municipalities wanted to rebuild Acrocité. So we have chosen the one which was the closest in order to allow the users to continue to attend Acrocité, and in fact we were speed up by the demolition, because the mayor has asked for the police to come to demolish, and I think this was somehow traumatic and aggressive. I mean, to see what she's proposing. In fact, there won't be a parking. It's just, of course, an interim for development. So there will be private houses that will be built there. By the way, her husband is a developer. And we learned then, that the practice could be also a fighting art. So we learned from Aikido that, sometimes you can, transform a situation and, a negative energy and transform it into a positive energy. And this demolition, we transform it, because we were equipped for, in fact, into a dismantling and reconstruction. So we stored all the material, and now we are in the process of rebuilding the Acrocité. But what is interesting is that now the users are the advocates of the new project. So it's them to explain to the neighbors, to do the process that we have started 5 years ago with them. What is the Acrocité about? What can be also for them to start the planting before the construction takes place, which is quite long, and the same in Bagneux. So we are currently building 2 Acrocités instead of 1. And I think this is quite rewarding somehow to see that sometimes, we have really shifted at another level of action, which is exactly this idea of a network. So we have, we will realize also the cooperative housing now in Bagneux, and also at another level, even in Paris, we have hijacked a competition, and we won to build a headquarter for Urban.
I don't need it. So, and I repeat what Doina she said very quickly. So, what is interesting in the new two Acrocité, there are people from the former one to come with us and to help us to develop the new dynamics, because they know how to do. And for this bigger project, so you develop new partnerships, one with the only ecological and ethical bank, because it must work with different banks, not with usual, with social entrepreneur company, national company, and the idea is to put them together in different hubs by topics, like social economy, like transition, like agro-food, etc. And even the building include a lot of closed circuits, like in the urban principle. So you want to recycling the, I don't know, everything from inside to have four types of urban agriculture, and the groups who you plan to be in the place, they are in this kind of dynamics, they develop these kind of programs. And the idea is to have a very good address in Paris, to come to watch an exhibition, to listen to, I don't know, a conference, and maybe if you have an idea, to knock to a door and to ask help for funding, for developing economic models, things like that. Because they are here, they work together, and to create another kind of collaboration in economy and everything. And this is a project with the hydroponics facade, with the ground floor who change in function of the weeks of the programs. Could be urban agriculture, could be local market, could be screenings, etc. And the idea is to be like a headquarter for social entrepreneur and ecological entrepreneur way of developing the city. And in fact, it's a way to develop in larger scale urban, even all these political problems. And with our partners, we launched a charter in COP21 with this occasion in 2015. And the idea is to develop new units in Parisian region, but not just. There are people involved in urban in London. There are people interested in Senegal, in other countries. And so what you was able to develop is like a progressive effect, like a very rhizomatic one, and maybe an autopoietic. So it's more and more self-developed by the stakeholders. But in the ethic issues, there was a lot of problems, some of them local, some other one there was political, and probably you was able to observe something like a missing of tool. And in our, maybe in our means, the architecture and right to the city, right to architecture could be like a first tool in order to act for a more ethical society, because like Jacques Rancière, he said representative democracy, it's in a gap with the common governance, and how to act in order to resist to that. And in our opinion, architects and urbanists, and maybe other professions too, you have a big responsibility in Europe especially, because you have the means to act.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful way also to end, pointing at the ethics of introducing a gap into the common governance. It's very clear that the governance model you developed, handing over power, handing over land, handing over, distributing the power into small groups to self-manage and become self-financing. It's a kind of governance that somehow then clashes with the official forms of governance, literally the party political governance system. So it's a very good example of sort of, as you say, existing within that, intervening a kind of governance that then exists in a state of agonism, where you don't get to decide in the end the result of the referendum. I would like actually to hold on to this question of ethics and hold on to your questions about the role that they had, the context of this particular project, how that project continued for them, but also what was left in that place for those people, the ethical questions of leaving. And let's come to the next example of practice. And then that hopefully leaves us time for a little bit of discussion here afterwards, where you can also discuss across the practices these different roles. So now I'm very happy to introduce Sandi, Hilal, and Alessandro Petti, who are both architects and founders of DAAR, Decolonizing Architecture and Art Residency. We're also very happy to welcome Alessandro to Stockholm, where he has now become the Professor of Social Justice at our Mayan Academy. DAAR is an art and architectural collective and a residency program based in Palestine. It combines discourse, spatial intervention, education, collective learning, public meetings, and legal challenges. And in this way, you can already start to see some of the common activities or acts of micropolitics in common between AAA and DAAR. And yet the forms that that takes and the instances and the effects might be quite interesting to discuss. DAAR explores possibility for the reuse, subversion, and profanation of actual structures of domination, from evacuated military bases to the transformation of refugee camps, from uncompleted governmental structures to the remains of destroyed villages. So very interesting examples that we look forward to learning more about.
All right. I hope you still have some energy. I'm looking at the time because I think we decided just to try. We had many ideas, but before starting, we were also trying to understand what could be interesting for you. And yeah, at the end, we decided just to take maybe around 15 minutes each and try to maybe describe one of the latest preoccupations that we have, or two of our projects, which is very different from what actually we planned, because since we are in Stockholm, maybe it's good that we talk about ourselves and the project that we have been doing, but then realize because of the time, and also sometimes might be more effective, that actually can focus on one specific things, which is also the one that at this very moment is actually very important for us. And maybe before I start, I would just like to have some response to the title of tonight, which is Ethics in Research, Practice and Activism. And I always felt in the moment that we have this desire to put ethics on a certain things, means that the reality is completely unethical. Means that we should not even question, if architecture has social, political, and ethical dimension. For me, that should be even for granted. But if we are here tonight, talking about that means that we have a big problem. Means that the mainstream architecture is unethical. The other thing I would like to say, that also what might be the research role in architecture, which is also a tricky specific things, because it's not research in social science or, I don't know, in other disciplines, but in architecture, to me, it's an interesting tension. And the tension has to do that if you are only an architect, you have to work for consensus. If you research, you might end up in discovering things that is very disturbing. And you might end up in challenging the main assumptions of your client. So research, in a way, it's very unproductive if you really want to be an architect. Because, somewhere research also deals with asking questions. But also, if we think about that architecture could be not only giving, let's say, solutions, but also asking important questions at this very moment we are not asking ourselves, this is what we think we are mobilizing architecture towards, this understanding of asking questions that maybe the mainstream architecture is not interested, or maybe it might be difficult to actually think only in terms of building and constructions and arriving to certain consensus. Let me start from this very first question, and here maybe I'll try really something almost wild, because I really want to take you directly into the project. And I hope that you will be missing the context, but I hope, I just want you to keep a little bit this feeling of just being trapped into this, and hopefully the context will emerge from what I'm going to say. If possible, I would like to have a little bit more dramatic thing. Can you kill this one and just have a light on me, so that me, of course, the images will be there, if it's possible. More? If it is more, I'll be even happy, but I will start. Refugee camps should not exist in the first place. They represent a crime and a political failure. For over a century, the social and political experiment in camps have not remained confined inside its walls and fences. They have contaminated and undermined the very Western notion of the city as a civic space in which the rights of the citizen are inscribed and recognized. Camps are established with the intention of being demolished. They are meant to have no history and no future. They are meant to be forgotten. The history of refugee camps is constantly erased, dismissed by states, humanitarian organizations, international agencies, and even by refugee communities themselves, in fear that any acknowledgement of the present undermine the right of return. The only history that is recognized within refugee communities is the one of violence, suffering, and humiliation. How then we understand the life and culture that people build in camps despite the suffering and the marginalization? It seems, in fact, that we acknowledge the history of refugee camps only after their destruction. In 2007, after the destruction of Nahr al-Bared in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, demanded the return to the camp. Similarly, in Syria, after becoming one of the most intense battlegrounds in Damascus, Palestinian refugee camps demanded the return to Yarmouk camp. The reaction to the destruction of these two camps force us to acknowledge the fact that the camp is not a place without history, but rather one rich with stories narrated through its urban fabric. Since their foundation, refugee camps have served to reconstruct, in a sense, and the demolished villages by reassembling their people and their social relations that bind them. So in understanding today's refugee conditions, beyond the humanitarian crisis, refugee heritage, which is the project that we started some years ago, trying to trace documents, reveal and represent refugee history beyond the narrative of suffering and displacement. Format for the nomination of properties for inscription of the World Heritage List, Annex 5, is the official UNESCO document whose implications for the issues were discussed over the course of 2 years within organizations and individuals, politicians, and conservation experts, activists, governmental and non-governmental representatives, and proximate residents. Members of the camp strongly expressed their fear that the nomination would change the status quo and threaten to undermine the legally recognized right of return. At the same time, many express their desire to see refugee history being acknowledged and an attempt to bring the right of return back to the center of the political discussion. DAAR, our architectural office and art residency in Palestine, and based on the work of Campus in Camps, which is an educational program that we established in the Haitian refugee camp, in consultation with associations and individuals living in the Haitian refugee camp and the Riwak Center for Architectural Conservation, we fill out the nomination form in the most respectful way with full awareness that our end goal is not UNESCO approval. We never had the illusion that recognition by UNESCO would imply the implementation of certain rights for refugees. Yet we also did not underestimate the potential for recognizing refugee heritage to start a needed conversation about the permanent temporariness of camps and the connection between rights and space. From the outside, there was a paradox in the heart of the application procedure. The World Heritage Convention states that, quote, universal values transcends the interest of individual state parties, ending quotes. Yet, the right to nominate is reserved to nation states who have signed, of course, the convention. In the case of Palestinian refugee camps, extraterritorial space carved out from state sovereignty, who has the right to nominate? The states within which camps are located? The state of Palestine? The Palestinian Liberation Organization? Or maybe the popular committees within refugee camps themselves? Or maybe the stateless nation that now count a population of more than 60 million. Beyond an intervention into political context of Palestinia's struggle for the right of return, the aim of nominating the Haitian refugee camp to UNESCO is also a way to destabilize and open up the dominant Western conception of heritage to a richer and more complex understanding. UNESCO emerged from the ruins of World War II as an organization dedicated to world peace through education. The World Heritage Convention, adopted by UNESCO in 1972, nearly 3 decades after its founding, has been signed now by 192 countries with the aim to protect natural and cultural sites of exceptional importance to humanity. The convention is built upon a Eurocentric understanding of heritage. In fact, just think that over half of currently inscribed sites are located in Europe and North America. However, we have to say that over time, the nomination process itself and the convention have been transformed into a public forum in which our understanding of heritage, culture, aesthetics, authenticity are actively debated and reshaped. In 1994, for instance, in the context of the conference, which was jointly organized by several organizations and UNESCO, the NARA document of authenticity was drafted to address the different ways that culture and social values are expressed and how led to acceptance of alternative conservation practices. In the same way, UNESCO has to recognize that how local people are in fact the primary source of information about local values, and recommends that the identification of the so-called outstanding universal value needs to be based on the wider participation by stakeholders, including local communities and indigenous peoples. Means that before was not like that. So, as a result, this and other initiatives expanded the categories for recognition. For example, if we think about the cultural landscape or the cultural roots, or also the very interesting notion of intangible heritage, have been incorporated, and UNESCO recognizes the need to engage and support local stakeholders in the protection and conservation of management of heritage. Indigenous people, minorities culture, and sometimes even states have begun to nominate sites where crimes such as slavery, genocide, and colonization were committed. In the last year, many groups have succeeded in their political struggle by wielding the power of heritage. Sites in Central America, for example, have been successfully nominated by indigenous community and environmentalists to stop mining projects. And there are several more examples. The State of Palestine, as signatory state, party of the Heritage Convention, has successfully nominated the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem and the cultural landscape of Batir. Just a few weeks ago, Hebron Al-Khalil Old Town, marking a fundamental success in the struggle for the recognition and protection of Palestinian heritage. So these acts have been accused of politicizing culture and criticized for undermining the very existence and purpose of the World Heritage List. What these critics fail to understand is that the World Heritage List has been politicized from the very beginning, insofar as it has, in a single gesture, glorified the presence and erased the history of sites built by colonial network of exploitations. The nomination and inscription of sites where human rights have been violated should therefore be seen as an historical acknowledgement. Instead of shying away from politically charged nomination, such acts can open up a political arena for reconfiguration of marginalized history. So we imagine this Annex 5 as a monumental building built during the colonial era, with which of this category corresponding to different rooms and spaces overly designed for antique purposes and its criteria corresponding to typologies and construction materials that were available at the time. In filling out the form, we saw ourselves as new inhabitants entering an old architecture, transforming it and adapt to a different form of life, sometimes drastically transforming its spaces, other times accepting the existing and knocking down some walls. I guess tonight I definitely will not have the time to go through the different part of these applications. And also, one thing I can do, I can invite you to look at the website, to read the applications, which is, of course, an ongoing still process that will be finalized in an exhibition that we have in Abu Dhabi in February 2019, where the material will be presented for the first time. But also what for us it's even more interesting is to look at the responses that many people, architects, activists, sociologists, and political leaders in a way felt they could engage. How is my time? 5 minutes? Okay. Maybe just 2 minutes? Just 2 minutes, because of course I don't want to take too space then for Sandi. But I just wanted maybe to show you how all these words, and I don't have the time to go through this, because all these discussions and all the documentations were part also of a larger strategy in which architecture also played a very important role. Because sometimes when you do research, you forget you are also an architect, and sometimes people close to us sometimes remind us, but you are also an architect, right? So why don't you do also something? So in this case, what we wanted is to give the trace and to engage with this incredible paradox of permanent temporariness. Being the camp, still conceptualized as something that is movable, it's made of tents, and not realizing that they are made of concrete houses. I didn't show you some of the images, or maybe you just saw them very quickly, in which today camps are urban environments, part of the cities, and we are still, negating this dimension. So the concrete tent, which is this intervention that you see, is first of all a place of gathering in which this discussion are taking place, but also formally, we wanted to really to embrace this paradox of permanent temporariness. And we made a tent made of concrete in order exactly to experience these contradictions that refugees live, you know, in which you are forced to think your life in a temporary condition, but at the same time, you are stuck in a situation, and sometimes you are stuck in a camp for decades. Today, the average existence of a refugee camps is already 23 years. Refugee camps in Palestine, in few years, they will be just 70 years old, almost. So, as 70 years old, a structure, even for architectural conservationists, you know, it's already a site for conservation. So, I will stop there, and I leave it to Sandi. Thank you.
So what I find hard normally is that, you know, we want to tell you a lot of things, almost 15 years of projects and lives, and I never know where to begin and where to end. And I was hoping actually to end by how did we arrive to Stockholm and what we are doing here. But of course, I will be having 2 minutes to speak about Stockholm, because I want to begin maybe following Alessandro's point is how to recognize temporariness, and what does that mean? Because if we don't recognize temporariness, we would not recognize the values of people's life for years. I mean, Palestinians are living there since 70 years, and if we are unable to recognize these lives, means that this life has no value. And the fact that how can we go beyond only the humanitarian assistance to refugees, but rather than to recognize the value and the culture of their life. And this was, I have to say, our struggle since the first day we began in working in refugee camp. But I would like to take you a bit now from heritage to public and to public spaces. And of course, public spaces are another very problematic notion within temporariness condition, because in a sense, you know, when we began to work with refugees, and I was heading a department in UNRWA, which is the UN that provides services for Palestinian refugees, and I was working in the south of the West Bank, and there was a very strong request, particularly from women, to have spaces inside the camp where they can pass sometimes with their kids. And of course, this was interpreted by the rest of the community, and maybe by myself and the other architects that were working with us at that time, is that the need is for a piazza, for a square, for a place. And of course, when we mentioned only the word, everybody was so freaking out in the camp, is that they were questioning, what does that mean? I mean, are we not only accepting the fact that we have concrete houses, we are building one house on top of the other, now we arrive to a point where we are even speaking about representing the public. And representing the public in the outside means accepting that this place exists. So we are all the time moving between this paradox of, yes, this place exists and the people lives there, but in the same time, it should not even exist. So how can you move between all this? And then, of course, you arrive to a request. We would like to have a place where our kids can play. It seems to be a very naive and simple request, but in a place like a refugee camp, it might be one of the most difficult ones. And I will try to tell you why. It's, I mean, if we will accept politically that we accept to represent the public, but then the other question was, because this was really sort of discussed among many of the camp and the refugees, and then they say, okay, we accept this politically, we sort of go with you into this, but then who will be managing this public? Because the camp is made out, I mean, I was working in UNRWA, and the UN says we only provide services. We don't administrate camps. So basically, the camp has no public, and in the same time, also the camp has no private, because people have only the right to use their houses. So in a place where you don't have very clearly these categories of private and public, what the collective common space, whatever we would like to call it, might look like. And, you know, in a sense, one of the response from the community, I have to say, it came, is that all what we need is a closed plaza. And of course, I mean, as an architect, all the time I studied architecture in Venice, and each time we were asked as students to design a public space, we felt good. We all the time felt that this is the ethical thing to do, this is the right thing to do, and in a sense you feel this is what I can contribute to the society. But then you work in a place like Palestine and you would understand that the public is something to fear and to be worried about and to understand. And so in that sense, people were immediately answering that all what we need is a closed place. And I mean, for me, is how can I understand a public that is closed? It's quite a very hard thing to perceive. And they explain to me one very important thing, is they say, because we don't have the public, because nobody can manage and take responsible of this, people need to have this act of passing the threshold, means entering in the plaza, making the action of getting inside the door, of getting from one place to another. And therefore, as it's whenever you enter a house, you should respect this house because you are the one entering this house. And they needed, and they feel that there is absolutely a need to have this plaza that is made of, basically at the end of the day, we ended up by having a plaza with 4 doors and 4 walls, and a sort of almost an open living room in the place. And this was very much also pushed by the women. And then, you know, after thinking how that this can be managed and how can we sort of having people taking the responsibility of making the action of entering the place, then who will be using the place? And of course, we are in a very conservative place where women have no right to actually be in the public at the end of the day. But Alessandro mentioned very quickly that we established a program called Campus in Camps, and it happened to be that we had 2 women from Fawar refugee camps actually that were enrolled in the program. And they began to mobilize a whole women movement they began to mobilize a whole women movement of the right of women to be in the public. And of course, this happens also because of the plaza, because of this very domestic, open, closed place that is in the place that actually helped them to feel that they are in a sort of their proper living room in the camp. And they now they are since 5-6 years actually mobilizing and using this place, going out for a coffee, playing sport, cooking together, having different activities happening in this plaza. But I would like really to take, I have only 5 minutes left, and I would like to take you very quickly to this question of what does it mean actually to be somebody that has no access to the public, and how people and communities can actually invent almost their own public and understand how they can have access to the public. And since we arrived to Sweden, I mean, we are living here since only 3 weeks, but I began a project with the Public Art Agency a few months ago, and I began this project in Boden. And not having the whole time to tell you, it's a very interesting story, all my encounter with Boden and the refugees there. But mainly what I felt very strongly is that what was happening in Boden and with refugees is not, with all the difficulties that they are living there, that the most difficult thing for them was to understand how can they have access to the public, because they felt all the time sort of eternal guests again in the place. And they also taught within language courses how they should behave in the public, and what does that mean, and there are codes, very codify places, and I felt from my experience there is that there is almost a fear of how they, and that they are all the time almost behaving in the wrong manner in the public. And I sort of immediately felt that some of them managed to turn their living rooms into these places where it's a very interesting political space, where they are insisting that if we will be inviting Swedish people to our living room, they would see us as humans, because the living room is almost this very interesting space that is transition between the public and private. It's in a place like the Arab world. And whenever we were, I lived in Palestine for almost all my life, and I was there during the first Intifada. And whenever we felt that we didn't have access to the public, what we did is that we turn our private houses into partially public, because this is the public where we can have agency. And I felt actually that there is, of course, what you will be finding a lot of time is that you will be finding Iranian living rooms, you will be finding Palestinian living rooms, which are these places that they create their own public. And this would all the time make a gap between what is the Swedish public and what is these sort of private public that are created. And in Boden, I found certain agency among certain refugees that they wanted actually to open their living room in order for this to become a sort of a parallel public. And they say what we understood is that as much as we invite people in our living room, as much as we can gain agency, as much as they can understand who we are, and it's like almost turning the whole idea of being guest and hosts into a complete, the whole dynamic would shift, because they say that finally we have the right to host when we are in our living room, and we become visible at a sudden, and we are invisible, and we are all the same in the public space, and feeling that we should almost be invisible, while in our living room we are sort of expropriating agency. Let me put it this way. And therefore, I don't know, it also brought me very strongly to what we did as DAAR and residency, and how ourselves we transform our living room into this space of creating politics and of dealing with politics, of negotiation, of refugee camps, etc. So I'm now, as Alessandro said, that we decided to actually only tell you the last two projects that we are working on, which is how to recognize the heritage of places that are destined to be only temporary places, and then how also to recognize public for people that are actually feeling themselves out of the public. And what does that mean, and how can we understand this public in a different manner? Thank you very much. And
Thank you very much. I would like to invite all of you up here to have a seat. Constantin, Doina, Alessandro, Sandi, and the lights will come up. We can breathe, and we have time for questions. These practices, both of them.
We are
yes,
sitting, right?
please have a seat. Make yourself comfortable in our public-private living room. So both of these practices, in various ways, in both of the presentations, you spoke about this kind of agonistic condition. Doina and Constantin, you spoke about the effort and the risk and the responsibility and maybe the disappointment of managing this agonistic condition over which you did not have all the control. And Alessandro, you started out by talking about the role of researcher entering into a space, disrupting a consensus, introducing divergence or perhaps dissensus, at the same time as you're surrounded by very difficult, destabilized conditions. So these are both very interesting examples of trying to create space, trying to disrupt a commons at the same time as managing the risk and the complicatedness of redistributing agency within these spaces. So there's a very interesting kind of common, perhaps, a discussion of what the ethics can be of taking responsibility for both disrupting, but then also taking on the risk involved in those situations. I want to open up the floor now to questions from you. We have a microphone which we can hand around, and we can look around for your hands.
Maybe some light on the public will be nice. Sorry for this obsession with light.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentations. I really enjoyed, and I'm so happy that I've seen that project in camps a few years ago, and it was really emotional for me to really hear that and your explanations. Actually, this is kind of, I don't know if there is any question, but I would like to raise this. There are some discussions about sustainable camps when it comes to sustainability, which again brings up this very complex issue about temporality, but also permanent, if they are permanent, if they are temporal. If we are talking about sustainability, it means kind of, I think this is, they think about some sort of solution for raising the quality of life of the camps, but I don't know if even it's possible. So I would like to hear if you have something to add about it. Thank you.
No, I mean, I still believe that what, you know, that the attempt is most of the time, and this is going towards this attempt, is that we feel that we can, that refugeness is an illness and that you are an ill person until we sort of cure you by making you a citizen. So the whole, so as if citizenship is the perfect antibiotic for refugees to become finally citizens. And of course, this is a solution for many refugees in terms of documents and in terms of, but that doesn't mean that you cure them from being in more than a place and from belonging to more than one place. And in a sense, I mean, this is another attempt to sort of almost say this is another special antibiotic, no? Is that we think about sustainable camps, so we feel that by this we sort of solve the problem. I don't think that this is a solvable problem and that we should accept that this should be solved, but rather than what I feel is that we should not escape from the problem, because the other way around is we even don't see camps, that they exist, because then you say, and you imagine that they should disappear the day after. They will not disappear the day after, but they should not even remain. So, and of course, this is the whole difficulty. How can you work with all this contradiction and respect people's life and respect the fact that they belong in more than a place, and what does that mean for them? And I think that in our case, we accepted to work within this contradiction, which is not easy, but we believe this is the only way to be able to operate.
Living with and working in contradiction. I wonder if Aikido.
Yeah, well, I wanted to make a parallel, in fact, between our two presentations and somehow respective projects, because I think somehow they are dealing with the same thing, which is this crisis of public space, public facilities, who has control on public space, and the fact that citizen, in your case refugees, in our case let's say ordinary citizen of metropolis, want to have control over their space and also over their life at the end, yeah. And then this issue of collectively manage, collectively control spaces, or sometimes that are evolving from private spaces in your case. Sometimes in our case it was a sort of political statement of re-implementing collective practices which have disappeared somehow in the city, in the Western city. Yeah, people are pushed to be individualistic and private rather than organize themselves and take control over their life. And somehow what we have proposed and enabled somehow was a form of public space which is collectively controlled, exactly like the space that you have described. And I think it's a sort of shared feeling. So it's not maybe the conditions are different and the way the discourse is different, but the attitude is the same. And also it's quite interesting to see, again, in parallel, this condition of being meant to be temporary and lasting forever, and in our case, being meant to last and being forced to be temporary, which is somehow, it has to do with space and space value and the way we are contextualizing space in different geopolitical with different geopolitical conditions. But I think we are living in paradoxical times, and probably we have to learn and to get skill as architects also in to deal with this type of spatial conditions, which are somehow bulversing our pre-received ideas of how space should be designed or should look like.
Thank you for the question. We have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to see if you wanted to add anything or respond before we see if any more hands are in the audience.
I mean, it's nicer to give it
Yes.
maybe to the audience, but yeah.
Here we go.
Yes, thank you so much, all of you. I'm interested in the knowledge processes. I'm interested in a lot, but I would like to comment on the knowledge processes. You seem to be very, very aware of acting specifically, step by step, and at the same time, you seem to be very aware of the systemic level in going back and forth, and also going back and forth between dialogues and your own thinking. Could you comment maybe a bit more in terms of a researching or a knowledge-making procedure?
May I start off this time? We just mentioned very briefly that at some point we established a university in a refugee camp because we realized that if you want to intervene in certain conditions, you have to deal with knowledge production. And that was, for us, an important step in understanding that we were intervening in an urban environment that we could hardly understand. We didn't have the conceptual vocabulary even to describe what you experience. When you enter a camp like the Hatia, the notion of public space and private space collapse. You have in front of you a fragment of a city so that people build by themselves, but legally the people cannot own their houses. So there is no private property. At the same time, these are environments, complex environments, in which there is no municipality. So one of the challenges was exactly how one can even think to intervene in a place where the category of understanding urban space, suddenly they collapse. And this is where we had to actually engage with these conditions, and we had to build what we call a collective dictionary was a series of terms that were naming things that we were experiencing, were naming things that people actually, they had knowledge of, but that was not maybe codified, or it was not made like, you know, understandable for other people in some way. So that was a very crucial point, and maybe that could be a link that can be made between the two presentations. And one of the key naming it was, if it is not private and is not public, what is it? This exists, so how you call it? And the way how you call it that is, an Arabic term is called al-masha, which is the common, which is exactly that people feel that what is a camp today, and this is specifically the Palestinian camps, because each camp, you know, has different history, and that was the other part of what I was trying to say, that we have to look at that history, that you can only have access and understand the social relation and the urban environment if you start to understand that people own that place collectively. And as far as I know, and I had very little experience, this is the only space where I actually experienced that, where, for example, there are examples that participants of campus camps were giving, in which when they were stepping out from the camp, they were saying, we are, you know, in not anymore feeling that we are at home, that is part of our own environment. So the streets of the camp are not yet the streets as we understand the streets in the city. This is why in the camp it's still possible to negotiate so many things, you know, where you open a window, where you can build things, because all of that, there is no authority up there that can, you know, there is a law in which you have to obey. No, this is constantly negotiated with a lot of conflict, but also built an incredible form of self-governance that I believe that, you know, today, this is a great lesson for understanding the periphery of metropolis, especially in Europe. So this was for us to build a university in the camp, is to say, this is the place in which knowledge is produced. And most of the time, this knowledge is completely out of the radar of what is understandable as knowledge. And that was, for me, a great lesson, start to recognize where also there is knowledge production. And that was an incredible call also for architects and for sociologists and for each one. It also is interesting in theory, because there you see a reality that is much forward than theory. It's much more radical, it's much more presence than just, you know, utopia about common spaces. The camp, it is the common and exists since 70 years. But, you know, seems that we are not understanding it.
That was a wonderful, clear linking of everything we have heard in the last 2 days. Knowledge, knowledge production, where does it come from? How do you act critically or radically? And coming back to this term common, where is common knowledge? Where is common space? And the title of Doina and Constantin's presentation. We're going to close the session now, but I would actually like to ask you to add your word from your dictionary and teach us the word common. Once more. One more time. Masher.
It's with the R finale, which is a very difficult Arabic letter.
See how much we have to learn from the field of practice and practitioners. Thank you very much.